Good morning. Welcome back. When we left Winston in Book 3, Chapter 1, he had just found himself in the Ministry of Love. And the person who walked in at the end of Chapter 1 was O'Brien. And O'Brien says to him, "They got me a long time ago." So we'll pick up right there where Winston finds himself now being carted off with O'Brien. So, Chapter 2. He was lying on something that felt like a camp bed, except that it was higher off the ground, and that he was fixed down in some way so that he could not move. Light that seemed stronger than usual was falling on his face. O'Brien was standing at his side, looking down at him intently. At the other side of him stood a man in a white coat, holding a hypodermic syringe. Even after his eyes were open, he took in his surroundings only gradually. He had the impression of swimming up into this room from some quite different world, a sort of underwater world far beneath it. How long he had been down there he did not know. Since the moment when they arrested him, he had not seen darkness or daylight. Besides, his memories were not continuous. There had been times when he was conscious, even a sort of consciousness that one has in sleep, had stopped dead and started again after a blank interval. But whether the intervals were days or weeks or only seconds, there was no way of knowing. So your question number 2 says, in the beginning of Chapter 2, Winston is experiencing a lack of consciousness and unconsciousness. What is that most likely due to? And I gave you a hint. Think about what that doctor was holding behind O'Brien just a moment ago. So Winston realizes that since O'Brien walked into his cell at the Ministry of Love, he doesn't know how long he'd been away from that moment, because so much had happened in that time where he was kind of conscious and then unconscious. And he talks about that weird feeling you get sometimes when you're sleeping. And like, if you ever like half wake up, but you're still like asleep kind of, and you don't really know, like, is this reality or am I still sleeping? So he kind of just went through a whole time of that, and he doesn't know how long it was between all that. So what most likely caused that for him? With that first blow on the elbow, the nightmare had started. So remember, as soon as we left him at the end of Chapter 1, he got hit on the elbow with that truncheon. Later, he was to realize that all that had then happened was merely a preliminary, a routine interrogation to which nearly all prisoners were subjected. There was a long range of crimes, espionage, sabotage, and the like, to which everyone had to confess as a matter of course. The confession was a formality, though the torture was real. How many times he had been beaten, how long the beatings had continued, he could not remember. Always there were 5 or 6 men in black uniforms at him simultaneously. Sometimes it was fists, sometimes it was truncheons, sometimes it was steel rods, and sometimes it was boots. There were times when he rolled about on the floor as shameless as an animal, writhing his body this way and that in an endless, hopeless effort to dodge the kicks, and simply inviting more and yet more kicks into his ribs, in his belly, on his elbows, on his shins, in his groin, in his testicles, on the bone at the base of his spine. There were times when it went on until the cruel, wicked, unforgivable thing seemed to him not that the guards continued to beat him, but that he could not force himself into losing consciousness. So basically, he's just been like beat within inches of his life. And your question 3 asks you to summarize Winston's cycles of beatings that he went through. So for example, his very first one that he mentions is that he was rolling around as shameless as an animal. So that's the first kind of cycle of beating he went through, is these people walking in, upwards of 6 men, he says, walk in and just kick him and punch him and hit him and kick him over and over and over again. And he's just writhing around like an animal. There were times when his nerves so forsook him that he began shouting for mercy even before the beatings began, and when the mere sight of a fist drawn back for a blow was enough to make him pour forth a confession of real and imaginary crimes. So there's another, type of cruelty happening to Winston. That's another part of his cycle that you could summarize in number 3, where now, he's talking about how even just the sight of someone rearing back like they're gonna punch him is enough for him to just confess everything. There were other times when he started out with a resolve of confessing nothing, when every word had to be forced out of him between gasps of pain, and there were times when he feebly tried to compromise, when he said to himself, "I will confess, but not yet. I must hold out till the pain becomes unbearable. 3 more kicks, 2 more kicks, and then I will tell them what they want." So now he's going through this cycle of trying to be mentally strong. So he's trying really hard to control the pain he's feeling and the ability to hold in his confessions. which, he's gonna fail at, because these people who are beating him have nothing to lose. Like, they're just gonna beat him until he says what he needs to say. So, part of his last cycle there is that he's trying to overcome his own mental strength. Sometimes he was beaten till he could hardly stand, and then flung like a sack of potatoes onto the stone floor of a cell, left to recuperate for a few hours, and then taken out and beaten again. There were also longer periods of recovery. He remembered then dimly, because there was spent chiefly in sleep or stupor. He remembered a cell with a plank bed, a sort of shelf sticking out from the wall, and a tin washbin, and meals of hot soup and bread, and sometimes coffee. He remembered a surly barber, arriving to scrape his chin and chop his hairs, and businesslike, unsympathetic men in white coats feeling his pulse, tapping his reflexes, turning up his eyelids, running harsh fingers over him in search of broken bones, and shooting needles into his arm to make him sleep. So the end cycle of his beatings now is Winston basically, being kind of taken care of. They just did all these like torture things to him in a cycle, and then after that they just kind of like make sure he's got some food and make sure he doesn't have any broken bones, and clean him up a little bit for the next stage, because the beatings grew less frequent and became mainly a threat, a horror to which he could be sent back at any moment when his answers were unsatisfactory. So number 4 was asking, what do you think that the cycle does to a person imprisoned? So if you were to imagine a person being in prison like Winston, what kind of mental strain is that doing to someone when they put them through that kind of torture? And then number 5 asks, after the cycle of beatings, he was no longer getting beaten frequently and is only threatened with them. So why do you think the government would do that? Why go through all that trouble of beating someone repeatedly in all these different fashions and really just breaking them down to nothing, and then just to like make the beatings less frequent, but then also to make sure that they're scared of them? Because Winston now says, mainly a threat, a horror to which he could be sent back at any moment if his answers were unsatisfactory. So what do you think the government is gaining from that, I guess? His questioners now were not ruffians in black uniforms, but party intellectuals, little rotund men with quick movements and flashing spectacles, who worked on him in relays over periods which lasted, he thought, he could not be sure, 10 or 12 hours at a stretch. These other questioners saw to it that he was in constant slight pain, but it was not chiefly pain that they relied on. They slapped his face, wrung his ears, pulled his hair, made him stand on one leg, refused him to leave to urinate, shone glaring lights in his face until his eyes ran with water. But the aim of this was simply to humiliate him and destroy his power of arguing and reasoning. Their real weapon was the merciless questionings that went on and on, hour after hour, tripping him up, laying traps for him, twisting everything that he said, convicting him every step of lies and self-contradiction, until he began weeping as much from shame as from nervous fatigue. So after they've done all these brutal beatings, now they're mentally beating him. And he uses the word shame to kind of describe his feelings through the torturous beating. So why do you think he might say shame? What do you think is shameful to Winston in all this? Sometimes he would weep half a dozen times in a single session. Most of the time they screamed abuse at him and threatened at every hesitation to deliver him over to the guards again. But sometimes they would suddenly change their tune, call him comrade, appeal to him on the name of Ingsoc and Big Brother, and ask him sorrowfully whether even now he had not enough loyalty to the party left to make him wish to undo the evil he had done. So basically they're just brainwashing him, right? These party members are just being like, 1 minute they're like, you're my friend, you're my buddy, you're my comrade, so tell me all the things you know. And then in the other hand, they're like, we're going to beat you, we're going to kill you. When his nerves were in rags after hours of questioning, even this appeal could reduce him to sniveling tears. In the end, the nagging voices broke him down more completely than the boots and the fists of the guards. He became simply a mouth that uttered, a hand that signed whatever was demanded of him. His sole concern was to find out what they wanted him to confess, and then confess it quickly, before the bullying started anew. He confessed to the assassination of eminent party members, the distribution of seditious pamphlets, embezzlement of public funds, sale of military secrets, sabotage of any kind. And not that this is a question on your reading guide, but did he do any of those things? Did he assassinate an eminent party member? Did he distribute pamphlets? Did he embezzle public funds or give away military secrets or sabotage? He didn't do any of that. He didn't do any of those things, and they forced him to admit that he did any of that, and he didn't do any of it. He confessed that he had been a spy in the pay of the East Asian government as far back as 1968. He confessed that he was a religious believer, an admirer of capitalism, and a sexual pervert. He confessed that he had murdered his wife, although he knew, and his questioners must have known, that his wife was still alive. He confessed that for years he had been in personal touch with Goldstein and had been a member of an underground organization which had included almost every human being he had ever known. It was easier to confess everything and implicate everybody. Besides, in a sense, it was all true. It was true that he had been the enemy of the party, and in the eyes of the party there was no distinction between thought and the deed. Which just, it blows my mind. So basically, he didn't do that much wrong. He didn't do that bad of things, and yet the party has him confessing to doing all these things he didn't actually do. Because at the end, he says, the party doesn't really distinct between what you really did and what you thought you did, because they're both the same. So, number 7 says, we talked a lot in our class about the idea of thought crime. Remember, we spent that whole day breaking down what we thought crime meant. So Winston is forced to confess not only thought crime, but also the deed of crime, because, quote, in the eyes of the party, there was no distinction between thought and deed. Does that agree or disagree with what you thought about thought crime and the comparisons that we made in class? Why or why not? So that's kind of a challenging question for you to, kind of mull over a bit that I don't really have an answer to. That's one you're just going to have to come up with on your own. There were also memories of another kind. They stood out in his mind disconnectedly, like pictures with blackness all around them. He was in a cell which might have been either dark or light, because he could see nothing except a pair of eyes. Near at hand, some kind of instrument was ticking slowly and regularly. The eyes grew larger and more luminous, and suddenly he floated out of his seat, dived into the eyes, and was swallowed up. I personally really like this passage because Orwell, the author, I think did a really good job of showing you what kind of mental state Winston is really in. And so your question in number 8 is that passage, and it says, what is happening to Winston? What is happening to Winston when he's sitting in this cell, which could have been either light or dark, he has no idea, but suddenly he sees this pair of eyes, like near to him. Some kind of instrument was ticking slowly and regularly, like a clock maybe. And the eyes are just growing larger and larger, and suddenly he just floats out of his chair and dives into the eyes and is swallowed up. So what does that tell you about what's going on with Winston's mental state? He was strapped into a chair, surrounded by dials under dazzling lights. A man in a white coat was reading the dials. There was a tramp of heavy boots outside, and the door clanged open. The waxen-faced officer marched in, followed by 2 guards. "Room 101, said the officer. The man in the white coat did not turn around. He did not look at Winston either. He was looking only at the dials. He was rolling down a mighty corridor, a kilometer wide, full of glorious golden light, roaring with laughter and shouting out confessions at the top of his voice. He was confessing everything, even the things he had succeeded in holding back under the torture. He was relating the entire history of his life to an audience who knew it already. With him were the guards, the other questioners, the men in white coats, O'Brien, Julia, Mr. Charrington, all rolling down the corridor together and shouting with laughter. Some dreadful thing which had lain embedded in the future had somehow been skipped over and had not happened. Everything was all right. There was no more pain. The last detail of his life was laid bare, understood, and forgiven. So basically, Winston is now being rolled off into room 101, and along the way, he believes that he sees in the corridor O'Brien, Julia, Mr. Charrington, all these other people, and they're just laughing hysterically. So, what is really happening? Do you think that's really happening? And if that's not what's really happening, what does that say about Winston's state of mind? So just kind of a little bit more in depth about where Winston really is within himself. Maybe not so much physically, but like where he really is mentally. Like where is Winston right now? He was starting up from the plank bed in the half-certainty that he had heard O'Brien's voice, all through his interrogation, although he had never seen him. He had had the feeling that O'Brien was at his elbow, just out of sight. It was O'Brien who was directing everything. It was he who had set the guards onto Winston, who prevented them from killing him. It was he who decided when Winston should scream with pain and when he should have respite, when he should be fed, when he should sleep, when the drug should be pumped into his arm. It was he who asked the questions and suggested the answers. He was the tormentor. He was the protector. He was the inquisitor, and he was the friend. And once, Winston could not remember whether it was the drugged sleep or in a normal sleep, or even in a moment of wakefulness, a voice murmured into his ear. "Don't worry, Winston. You're in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." He was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him that we shall meet in the place where there is no darkness, and in that other dream he had 7 years ago. He did not remember any endings to this interrogation. There was no period of blackness and then the cell or room in which he now had gradually materialized around him. He was almost flat on his back and unable to move. His body was held down at every essential point. Even the back of his head was gripped in some manner. O'Brien was looking down at him gravely and rather sadly. His face, seen from below, looked coarse and worn, with pouches under the eyes and tired lines from nose to chin. He was older than Winston had thought him. He was perhaps 48 or 50. Under his hands there was a dial with a lever on top, figures running around his face. "I told you," said O'Brien, "that if we meet again, it would be here." "Yes," said Winston. And we're going to pause there for today. But throughout the torture, the beatings, and the confessions, Winston believes that O'Brien has been at his side, even though he's not seen him since the initial time in the cell in Chapter 1's end. He hears a voice at one point telling him, "I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." If that is O'Brien, what do you think it means? What does O'Brien maybe mean? I mean, if he did say that, "Don't worry, Winston, you're in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come, and I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." What does he mean by that? And it's going to get pretty graphic after this, so be prepared.